With a 200 to 230 margin, Democrats in the House of Representatives seem to have jumped on the bandwagon in favor of impeachment. But presidential candidate and Hawaii Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard says voters must be the one to remove a president from office.
Joining us now to discuss her reaction to plans to move forward with an impeachment inquiry, corruption in politics, the Democratic debate, and so much more is Congresswoman Gabbard.
Congresswoman, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks
we really
for being
appreciate
here.
it.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Of course. So first of all, the top of the news at today, there's of course the transcript of the President of the United States' phone call with Ukraine that has been released. You've spoken previously about impeachment last night. You thought it would be incredibly divisive for the country. This is something that much of the caucus, though, seems united in pursuing. Has your mind changed on the issue of impeachment after that transcript has come out?
It hasn't.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think when you step outside of the bubble here in Washington and you get to where most folks in the country are, look, I'm not a lawyer, but I think most people reading through that transcript are not going to find that extremely compelling cause to throw out a president that won an election in 2016. And instead, what I think most people will see is, hey, this is another move by Democrats to get rid of Donald Trump, further deepening the already hyper-partisan divides that we have in this country. And that's really where I'm coming from. Look, Donald Trump is corrupt. He is unfit to serve our country as president. He is unqualified to serve our country as commander-in-chief. I'm running for president to defeat him. I just think it's so important for our country to be able to move forward, to bridge these divides, that it be the American people that make this decision.
Mm-hmm. Let's put a little bit of the transcript up with regards to what he said about Vice President Biden. He said specifically in speaking with the Ukrainian president. The other thing, there's a lot to talk about Biden's son, that Biden stopped the prosecution. A lot of people want to find out about that. So whatever you can do with the attorney general would be great. Biden went around bragging that he stopped the prosecution. So if you can look into it, it sounds horrible to me. I mean, that sure sounds like the President of the United States pressuring a foreign ally to go after a political opponent.
He is using his position for his own political gain. I think that's very clear. It's also not surprising. Yeah. I mean, this is something that Donald Trump has been doing throughout his time in the White House, both here in our domestic politics, in his relationships with other countries. So this is again further just another example of his corruption and how self-serving he really is. You know, we need a president who will put the interests of the American people first and foremost, put the interests of our country first, and Donald Trump is not that guy.
What do you say to people who say, is there any line that he could cross? You know, of course impeachment would be divisive, but there has to be check and balance. We have to uphold the rule of law. He's gone way beyond what's appropriate or proper for a president. We have to draw the line somewhere.
I don't like to speak in hypotheticals, take every situation as they come, but the American people are aware of what is happening. They are seeing how this thing is playing out. And I think it's, again, most important for them to be the ones who make the decision about who our next president should be, understanding how self-serving this president is and why it's important that we as a country, Democrats, Republicans, independents, come together to defeat him.
Congressman, I also want to ask you actually about the underlying charge that the president is making there against Joe Biden, who is your opponent in this race. There's been a lot of discussion. His son received $50,000 a month from a Ukrainian energy company. He apparently was part of a private equity firm that inked a $1.5 billion deal with the Chinese government. Do you think those are legitimate lines of inquiry for any of his opponents, and do you find them problematic and evidence of corruption?
I'll be very honest. I don't know the details of what Hunter Biden was doing or who he was working for, what kind of interactions he was having, whether it be with Ukraine or any other country. I think for all of us who are running for president, our records are up for examination by the voters in this country, and it's up to us to be able to answer those questions and to speak to the kind of leadership that we seek to bring. And obviously, Vice President Biden is subject to that as well.
Yeah.
I think corruption is a deep concern that a lot of Americans have. That's not a partisan issue, frankly.
I agree with that.
Politicians on the left and the right have all personally cashed in on their positions. Their family members have cashed in. If you were president, how would you put an end to that?
by closing the revolving door and closing so many of these loopholes that allow elected officials to personally benefit, whether it be financially, through influence, or through power, that we've seen, as you said, rightly so. I mean, this is people from both political parties have too often been more self-serving for themselves or their family members, rather than seeing this incredible opportunity that we have as a job of service. It is a service to the American people who are entrusting us with their votes. You know, I think one example that often comes up is members of Congress who are able to impact and vote on legislation that will help their stock holdings. You know, I mean, there was legislation that was passed that would have banned that, and then of course it was overturned, so that this is something that's allowed to continue. There are so many examples, too many examples, that show how members of Congress come into this position with very little financially and somehow leave 5-10 years later, you know, millionaires, multimillionaires. And it does beg the question, what's really going on there in Washington? And the American people say, hey, I know one thing is true. Washington is filled with self-serving politicians who are beholden to the very few, the rich and powerful, rather than truly embodying the vision that Abraham Lincoln laid out for us, being a government of, by, and for the people. And that is where we've got to get back to.
Well, I know corruption is one of the main themes of many of your opponents in this race. You just qualified for the 4th Democratic debate.
Congratulations.
Congratulations on that. Krystal and I are very glad to see you up there, particularly to talk about foreign policy. Let's talk a little bit about that process. Was it frustrating to see the DNC choose which polls would and would not qualify? And do you feel that there was some unfairness in that process? It's great that you made it up on the stage, but you weren't there for the third time, the third debate.
There's been a lack of transparency in that whole process about which polls are selected, which aren't, which they're seeing as qualifying, which ones are actually polling. And when you have a lack of transparency for voters in our Democratic primary process, then you're seeing the lack of trust starting to grow, or they're saying, what's really going on here? And they're very spending time with voters in Iowa and New Hampshire, they don't take kindly to seeing how a few people in Washington, D.C. At the DNC are trying to be the gatekeepers to say, well, here are the people we think you should be allowed to choose from as voters, and you don't get to hear from any of these other people, because they recognize and take the responsibility that they have as voters very seriously in determining who our Democratic nominee should be, and eventually who will go on to be president.
So 538 recently noted that I think one of the latest polls out of Iowa was great news for Tulsi Gabbard. That was part of the headline. You've spent quite a bit of time in Iowa. What is something in Washington and the political press corps is completely missing about what you see on the ground that really animates and is animating voters in Iowa, and explains your own rise in that poll?
I'll say two things that Washington is completely missing. I think there's a lot that we could talk about. When you see the disconnect between what's driving headlines and tweets here in D.C. versus the questions people are asking in our town hall meetings. But what I am inspired by, and what I draw hope from, is that at every single one of our gatherings, small or large, big city, small town, we have Democrats, Republicans, independents, libertarians coming together, recognizing, hey, we don't agree on everything. There are some things we even strongly disagree on, but they're coming together recognizing how central the issue of the cost of war is to being able to resolve so many of the challenges we face here at home. So whether your top issue is healthcare or education or infrastructure, criminal justice reform, immigration reform, it requires resources. And unless we deal with this terribly high cost of war, this high human cost of war, the trillions of dollars that have been taken out of our pockets, out of our communities, out of our schools, healthcare system, and so on, going to pay for these wasteful regime change wars, and now this new Cold War and arms race, unless we deal with this, we will not have the resources that we need to either put that money back into the pockets of the American people or use those resources to serve the American people. And that's where our campaign is growing, our support is building in a way that is unifying the American people, saying we love our country, we will put the interests of the American people first, end these wasteful regime change wars, this new Cold War and arms race, and do just that, redirect those dollars back towards nation building, our communities right here at home.
So you've been critical of Senator Harris in the past and even went so far as to question whether she was prepared to be commander-in-chief. We now see Senator Warren really rising in the polls. She's first in a lot of national polls and several state polls as well, early state polls. Do you believe that she's prepared to be commander-in-chief?
I haven't seen much come from her in the way of what kind of leadership and decision-making that she would bring to that most important responsibility that the president has as commander-in-chief. And just as a soldier and an American, that's very concerning for me. So, you know, for voters, I think that's an important thing to look out for from everyone who's running for president, is what kind of experience do you have in this area? What kind of depth and understanding do you bring to these very nuanced and complex issues with how the United States is relating with other countries? What kind of leadership we're providing in the world, and having the kind of foresight and judgment that we've seen leaders from across both party lines have lacked for far too long, that have brought us to this position where, you know, for all three of us, we've seen our country at war for the vast majority of the years that we've been alive.
One thing we debated this morning was, when we heard the news that you were going to be up on the stage, is who are you going to kneecap next? Last time it was Kamala Harris.
I saw that too.
Yeah. We had a big debate. We were like, who is she going to take out? You effectively ended Kamala Harris's candidacy. She's down at 3% in the latest, I think, Emerson poll. Who's the next target for you?
I'm actually running for president.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
I just want to remind everybody that.
Yeah, that's right.
No, that's. I mean, look, it's a great platform to be on the debate, to be able to speak to millions of people across the country, and so that is what I'm looking forward to doing, is to be able to make my case to them, offer why I'm offering to serve them, the experience that I would bring to this role as commander-in-chief, and why it is such a central issue to everything else that we're facing.
Well, one of the things that has been tremendously disappointing to me, and I think is part of why I was so sorry that you weren't on the last debate stage, is because there has been so little focus on foreign policy.
Exactly.
And this is the arena where the commander-in-chief does have the most power, right? This is one of the most important exercises of power in that office. What has been your sense of that conversation, and what would you like the debate moderators to focus on this time on this next debate stage?
Look, I think it would be very valuable for voters to have a foreign policy focused debate, period.
Yeah.
Given that this is the most important responsibility the president has, given we're seeing right now with President Trump occupying the Oval Office, pushing us to the brink of an all-out inferno of a war with Iran that would go across the region, be far more costly than anything we saw in Iraq, tearing up the nuclear deal with Iran. Every day that goes on that we are not in that deal, Iran is moving forward and developing a nuclear weapon. I mean, the tearing up of the INF Treaty. You see all of these different examples of how consequential these decisions are. I think that voters deserve more than just having one or two foreign policy related questions in a 2-hour-long debate with 30 to 60-second answers coming from candidates. It does not do the issue justice. It does not do our servicemen and women justice who have to live with the consequences of who our commander-in-chief is, and it doesn't do justice for the American people.
One thing I think is interesting after this UNGA, a lot of the news is impeachment, but if we actually went back, we watched President Trump's speech, it was a nationalist speech, a renunciation of globalism. Yes, there was rhetoric on there that was very tough on Iran, but it does sound sometimes like a lot of what you advocate for. Do you consider yourself a nationalist? How do you look at your orientation in foreign policy?
I think that's a word that has become very tainted, and it depends on who is saying it and what they mean by it.
Sure.
Look, my interest and my goal has always been and will continue to be, how can I best be of service to the American people and our country? I think it's important for us to be the kind of leader in the world engaging with other countries in a way that is positive, where we can be a force for good, rather than continuing the policies we've seen for so long of our country really trying to be the world's police, bullying and running around saying, well, we've got the greatest military in the world, do what we say or else, and seeing our foreign policy as a zero-sum game, that it has to be, for the American people to win, your country must lose or your people must lose. Instead, seeing like with China, for example, obviously we have some very clear areas of difference related to trade and security, but there are also areas where we have shared interest. A lot of talk about climate change right now, rightly so. We cannot begin to make the kinds of changes we need to see to address climate change unless we have the ability to build a strong working partnership with countries like China, like Russia, India, and others. So the kind of leadership I'd bring as president is one that would bring that foreign policy that's focused on cooperation rather than conflict, so that we can resolve these differences and move forward.
One of the questions in that third debate was, would you keep the tariffs on China? Many of your opponents were not very well prepared for that answer. I want to give you an opportunity, because I think that's a very interesting question for all Democrats running for president.
Yeah, I think it's a broad question. I think that a lot of the escalation of tariffs that Trump has done, I would roll back. I would take a more measured approach and see what actually makes sense as we move forward in these negotiations to be able to work out these differences. I think the problem with Donald Trump's approach to this has been, like we've seen his approach to so many things, a very emotional, erratic, kind of shoot from the hip response, creating so much uncertainty and really destabilizing our own economy. I hear from Iowa farmers more and more every time I'm there talking with them how, as time goes by, some of these family farms are literally saying, well, we can't, we're packing up the farm, we cannot farm anymore. And these are generations of farmers, because they don't know if they'll have someone to sell their crops to next year, and they can't survive waiting and waiting to see what happens. And once again, Trump does these things without thinking through the consequences, both on our people here at home, but also what happens when you continue to escalate in a very uncertain way an economic war with a nuclear armed country like China.
Something I've really appreciated is your willingness to criticize Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
Who are our top allies in a Tulsi Gabbard administration?
Look, those who share our interests, and I think India, for example, is a strong partner in the Asia-Pacific region.
How does human rights figure into that? Obviously, India's come under a lot of scrutiny recently for their treatment in Kashmir. And how does that figure into that?
I think it is a factor, but it cannot be the only factor. I think we can see how we can be a force for good and positive influence to be able to encourage addressing some of these human rights conditions that we're seeing in different countries that we have to deal with in the world. But I really take a realist approach and a pragmatic approach to say, let's see where we have differences we can work out, recognize the shared interests that we have, and be able to move forward in both respects.
Another thing I wanted to get at with you, I've seen you speak previously, is a denunciation of identity politics.
Yeah.
It's something that very much puts you out of odds with the mainstream of the Democratic Party. Why do you think that identity politics is destructive, particularly as a congresswoman of color and within the Democratic Party?
Because it's being used to tear people apart. It's being used to pit one tribe or one team against another, whether it be based on ethnicity or race or religion or orientation, when we are at a time in our country where we must come together. We have to come together, because the longer we continue to allow ourselves to be divided like this, for people to further their own political interests, the weaker we are as a people and as a country. There is so much that unites us. And again, this is what I find inspiring as we go and meet with different people all across the country, the diversity that we have in this country, and how beautiful it is that we can come together around these uniting principles, our freedoms enshrined in our Constitution, that inspire us to work together towards that more perfect union with equality and justice for all. I actually, at all my town hall meetings, we hand out copies of the Constitution and Bill of Rights, because I think a lot of people either haven't read it or don't think about it or don't understand it. But I think it's important for us to be reminded of the bedrock of our country and who we are. That can light the path forward for us about where we need to go.
So Senator Sanders very directly uses the language of class warfare. He says if there's a class war going on, it's about time that the working class won it. He just released a big plan for a wealth tax that's more aggressive even than what Senator Warren had put out. What do you think about a wealth tax?
I'm not opposed to it. I think there are different ideas out there that I'm looking at. I don't think class warfare is something constructive for us. I think we should tackle the root cause of this, which is crony capitalism. Rather than pitting one group of Americans against the others, let's get to the heart of the problem here, which is how massive corporations like Amazon are able to exploit American taxpayers, go without paying any taxes at all, get a tax credit in addition to that, while we have small business owners all across this country who are paying their fair share, paying their taxes, employing people, serving as the backbone of our economy, and struggling just to survive. So we've got an unfair system that really does benefit the very few rich and powerful, and that's what we've got to focus on correcting.
I have a final question for you, ma'am. On the issue of big tech, you sued Google.
Yes.
They've suppressed, or at least suppressing search results or traffic to your website during one of those debates. Do you think that it's time to break up big tech? That's something Senator Josh Hawley recently asked Mark Zuckerberg to sell WhatsApp and Instagram. Is that something that you would support?
I do.
Yeah.
I've supported this for quite some time because we're seeing how dangerous it is when you have these big tech monopolies, specifically Google and Facebook, who have an inordinate amount of power over most people who use a number, whether it's Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, YouTube, Google. I think it's dangerous. And we're seeing how, whether it's someone who's low level in these companies or maybe high up, or they have the algorithms really that can control and impact what pops up on your Facebook feed and in what order, what pops up when you type in something in Google search, canceling or deleting somebody's account on YouTube even though they're in compliance with their terms and agreement because they don't like the things that they're saying. So I think these are things that whether we're specifically the ones being targeted or not, we should all be concerned about because it really impacts so many of us in our daily lives.
Yeah, I mean, the size of these companies just gives them so much power and control that we can't even fathom.
And anytime someone tries to form a startup to compete or provide an alternative, very quickly they're gobbled up or defeated.
They're either crushed or
bought
eaten.
up.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Congresswoman, thank you. Thank you so much for stopping by.
Appreciate
Great
it.
to see you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
We'll have more Rising after this.